You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
If I'm to trace a pair of shoes from the community in central Massachusetts where they're made, all the way to the Louisiana plantation where they're worn, I can tell a million different stories. And they're not just stories of like, this person's shoes looked like this, but really about, say, a farming family and their subsistence strategies in Massachusetts as they make decisions about how to allocate the labor of a daughter or a wife over wintertime to make shoes as opposed to growing onions. All the way then down to an enslaved man in shoes who is contemplating escape and whose probability and prospects for fugitivity depend very much on having footwear that can allow him to move through space and protect his body as he travels through a very inhospitable landscape.
Hello, and welcome to episode 422 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we talk about slavery in early America, we often focus on the plantation, their large fertile fields, their cash crops, and the people who labored on those fields to produce those cash crops under conditions of enslavement. But what about the seemingly ordinary objects that made slavery work? The shoes, the axes, the cloth, and the hoes. What can these everyday objects reveal about the economic and social systems that sustained slavery in the early United States? Seth Rockman, a professor of history at Brown University and author of Plantation Goods, A Material History of American Slavery, a book that was a finalist for the 2025 Pulitzer Prize in History, joins us to rethink how Northern manufacturing, labor, and commerce were entangled with the Southern slave economy. Now, during our investigation, Seth reveals how New England manufacturers produced the clothing, tools, and textiles used by enslaved people in the South, the surprising ways Northern laborers and Southern plantations were connected through everyday goods, and what everyday objects like hoes, shoes, and axes can teach us about resistance, race-making, and the economics of slavery in the early United States. But first, do you ever wish you could go behind the scenes more often with experts who study early American history? Join us inside the History Explorers Club, where curiosity comes alive. Every month, you'll enjoy live conversations with historians, plus quarterly workshops that take you inside the historian's craft, how they uncover sources, solve mysteries, and bring the past to life. It's like a backstage pass to history. Membership in the History Explorers Club reopens soon, so be sure you join the waitlist so you'll be the first to know when you can join. Visit historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club to join the waitlist. All right, are you ready for our journey into the everyday goods that made slavery possible? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a professor of history at Brown University, where he studies the period between the American Revolution and the United States Civil War. His research focuses on the intersection of slavery studies, labor history, the history of capitalism, and material culture studies. He's known for his award-winning book, Scraping By: Wage Labor, Slavery, and Survival in Early Baltimore, and he joins us today to discuss details from his new book, Plantation Goods: A Material History of American Slavery, which was a finalist for the 2025 Pulitzer Prize in History. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Seth Rockman.
Hey, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Well, Seth, we have a lot to talk about today. Your new book, Plantation Goods, is fascinating, and it does an excellent job of taking us through the material history of slavery, or the everyday things that made slavery possible within the early United States. So could we start by having you tell us about the material goods of slavery and what drew you to study them?
So there's this category of really boring things in the early 19th century called plantation goods. And I have written a book about these really boring things. Hats and hoes and shovels and shoes and boots and textiles, all of which constituted the material infrastructure of plantation labor. These were crucial inputs to sustain the system of agricultural commodity production in the American South. And I was interested in the New England manufacturers who rushed into this space to supply plantations, slaveholders, and ultimately enslaved people with the material infrastructure for that system.
You call these boring things, but hats and hoes and shovels, these are the everyday things of everyday life.
This is exactly right. These are low-tech things, but these are things that have huge consequences for how people move through the world. So, for example, if I'm to trace a pair of shoes from the community in central Massachusetts where they're made, all the way to the Louisiana plantation where they're worn, I can tell a million different stories. And they're not just stories of like, this person's shoes looked like this, but really about, say, a farming family and their subsistence strategies in Massachusetts as they make decisions about how to allocate the labor of a daughter or a wife over wintertime to make shoes as opposed to growing onions, all the way then down to an enslaved man in shoes who is contemplating escape and whose probability and prospects for fugitivity depend very much on having footwear that can allow him to move through space and protect his body as he travels through a very inhospitable landscape. And of course, all the hands in between, the advertisers, the merchants, the creditors who participate in creating a national market in these goods, linking then that New England farming family to that Louisiana enslaved family, again, through something as mundane as a pair of pretty ordinary shoes.
Now, years ago, when Seth was workshopping an earlier part of what became his new book, Plantation Goods, he mentioned that he wanted to show the connections between New England laborers and factory owners who worked to create and produce plantation goods, these everyday implements of life and work on the plantation, to the institution of slavery in the early United States. Seth, now that you've finished your book, did your study of these everyday goods allow you to research and understand more fully the connections that you saw and the connections you wanted to make between New England produced goods and slavery?
Absolutely. And this is really what's at the heart of the book. How do we tell stories about early American history that link lives and livelihoods separated by thousands of miles, but that constitute a common system? And of course, in the United States, as you know, the stories we typically tell about New England's industrial development and the expansion of plantation slavery are not usually told together. We have this Civil War looming ahead in 1861, where in order to explain it, we pretty much need a New England economy that's headed in one direction towards industrialization, towards free labor, and a plantation economy in the Deep South that is ever more embedded in human exploitation through chattel slavery and the transformation of indigenous lands into plantations, growing the most important cash crops in the world economy. And if one economy is headed one direction in New England and the southern economy is headed the other direction, it's easy to say, I see, the center cannot hold, the union falls apart, end of the story. And I'm much more interested in those previous 4 decades, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and into the 1850s, where we should think about the relationship of New England and the plantation South not as antagonistic, but rather as synergistic. And so the goal of this book, by tracing these goods from New England to the plantation South and seeing how they create linkages of different kinds of lives and different kinds of American experiences, but one common system, a United States whose economy, North and South, depends crucially on plantation labor, both as, say, the provider of the cotton that feeds the mills in New England, but also as a crucial market for New England manufacturers who are trying to figure out how to manufacture because they're not that good at it yet. And they're looking for opportunities to produce goods that are, again, fairly low tech, where the quality controls might be relatively low, and where there is literally a captive market. That is to say, enslaved people who need to be provisioned with these goods on a regular basis and slaveholders who are looking for cheap sources of those goods.
Now, before we explore these connections more deeply, Michaela would like to know how you chose the different objects, the different plantation goods that you wrote and highlight in your book. Would you tell us why you decided to investigate Cullen's axes, slave cloth, and ready-made clothing and shoes?
This is a wonderful question, and it's an important one for any researcher who's designing a project, because you have, of course, great visions at the beginning of a project, and then you run into the archive, and the archive giveth and the archive taketh away. And so when I began conceptualizing this as a material culture project, I was thinking, oh, of course, I will find this specimen in this museum and this artifact in that museum, and I can build around those. But it turns out the everyday kinds of provisions that are produced in New England for use on plantations in the American South are not readily available within museum collections or other kinds of spaces. And there are a couple of reasons for this. I mean, one, these goods were meant to be used up into oblivion, and they often were. For enslaved people who were issued a certain quantum of cloth each season, when that cloth wore out, it was cut up into bandages, it was used as patches, it was stuffed into the toes of shoes to create insulation. This is not the kind of stuff that then survives. Nor is this the kind of stuff that museums and other historical societies would have been particularly interested in collecting at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. When Lonnie Bunch, who was then the director of the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, when he was in the collecting phase for that new institution, he was asked what would he most like to find for their holdings. And he said, everyday work clothing from enslaved people. And I'm unlikely to find it because it just doesn't survive. Likewise, when we're looking at tools, the production of these tools doesn't change dramatically between 1870 and 1830 in terms of, here's a specimen, we can say that this is definitely from 1854 versus this one is definitely from 1881. And so it's hard to date these kinds of things, again, precisely to the times of slavery. So I ended up with a fairly limited material culture base on which to write this book, to my great disappointment. But what I did find, and what really blows this book open, archivally speaking, is that the records of these New England firms that specialized in plantation goods, these records are enormous and they're incredibly robust, and they tell us a huge amount about life in the American South. So if you and I were thinking about how to design a project and we wanted to know more about the lived experience of an enslaved family in Mississippi, it would not occur to either one of us to travel to Rhode Island to do so. But it turns out that the holdings of the nation's leading producer of slave clothing, a company in southern Rhode Island run by a man named Roland Gibson Hazard, who figures very prominently in the book, the records of his firm, which ultimately is called the Peacedale Manufacturing Company, these records are so abundant that it would take us an entire career to read through simply what's at the Rhode Island Historical Society. But it turns out there's even more at the Baker Library of Harvard Business School, and their Hazard collections at the South Caroliniana Library in the University of South Carolina, at the Georgia Historical Society, at the Mississippi Department of Archive and History, at the Louisiana and Lower Mississippi Valley Collection at LSU, and numerous other repositories. And so a company like this gives us insight into then the sort of R&D process that went into designing particular kinds of woolen textiles intended for enslaved people to wear. And likewise, the records of the Scoville Hoe Company in Haddam, Connecticut, or the Collins Manufacturing Company in Collinsville, Massachusetts. These firms, they saved a great deal of stuff. And what they saved were letters from slaveholders, from merchants, from traveling salesmen, from company agents, writing back what they were seeing and what they were finding as they traveled through South Carolina, as they traveled through Georgia, as they traveled through Mississippi, and in many cases talked to enslaved people about what they were actually seeing and how these goods were being used and how they could be designed differently or better. So in many cases then, jumping back to your original question, the book is organized in some ways as an artifact of the archive. It's not, aha, I have this particular shoe, thus I can write an entire section on this particular shoe, but more that I have the records of these firms, and these firms open up a set of possibilities for narrating how labor is organized in a New England community where everyone is weaving, or how New York City merchants are choosing to market and advertise this stuff, all the way to how slaveholders are making decisions about what to buy and how to distribute these goods to enslaved people's choices about how to modify these goods. It's all there in this archive.
It sounds like the methods you used are almost the reverse of the methods used by others who study material culture, in the sense that we've spoken with Zara Annis Hanslin and Maeve Kane and other scholars who study material culture, and they usually talk about the artifacts or the objects they found in the archive or in the museums, and how they look at these objects to get leads for where they might look for information among written sources to get information about what they're studying. Conversely, you had to start with the written record to find information about the objects New England factories produced because enslaved people use these objects so heavily that there are few examples of them, if any, that survive.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, to be fair, there are still material artifacts in the book that I want to think with. I have a pair of shoes that I think a lot about. Another sort of weird artifact that is abundant in the archive are textile samples. That is to say, small, like 2-inch by 2-inch squares of fabric that are straight pinned to letters from a slaveholder to a New England manufacturer saying, "This is what we got last year. Could you make me 500 yards of something similar?" Or from a New England manufacturer writing to a Charleston merchant saying, "Hey, this is what we're producing this year. Do you want 10,000 yards or 20,000 yards?" And these samples then get folded up into the letters and are saved in the paper archive. And there's this remarkable experience of then unfolding these. The other thing that I was able to do sort of in terms of material culture methodology was to engage in some reconstruction. And this was perhaps one of the most exciting pieces of this project and something that was totally new to me, and probably also that added some significant time to the amount of years that went into producing this book. But somewhere along the way, I learned how to weave. It occurred to me that I probably shouldn't be spending that much time writing about woolen textiles and the people sitting at looms if I didn't know how looms would work. And so I had some contracts that these New England firms had signed with local families who were doing outwork weaving in this period. That is to say, being issued yarn that they then put on their own looms and completed at home. And I took this to a place called the Marshfield School of Weaving in Vermont, a place that does typically fairly high-end reconstruction work. So if you're a historic home museum and you want to reupholster the dining room chairs and you cut a small sample from underneath and send it to them and they figure out how to reproduce it, no one had ever come to them with these kinds of written sources, nor with the desire to make really low-quality goods. So it was an amazing experience then to work with them to create several yards of this cloth that this Rhode Island company was marketing in the South. And they had to explain everything to me, Liz, like a complete idiot, because when it comes to textiles, I'm a complete idiot and knew nothing. So all the kind of tacit knowledge that an 8-year-old girl would have had in 1828, I did not. So they said, well, go over to the warping board. And I'm looking around. I don't know what the warping board is. And they're like, okay, great, but do all this kind of stuff. Then pick the cross. I don't know what that means. Oh, it's like making a cat's cradle. Yeah, I don't really know what that means. At that point, they just sort of looked at me really with a great deal of suspicion. But I learned so much from all the stuff that had to be articulated. And to then sit at a loom and think about how one's mind wanders, or to think about how one's body hurts, or to think about the kind of rhythm you get in as your feet and hands are moving at the best sort of way. And then what happens when a warp end breaks? Do you get up and decide this is the moment to go tie it off? Or do you think, well, it's just for slaves. I don't need to do that. They don't care. These kinds of questions all sort of came to me as I was having the experience of weaving. And I think that the way that I'm able to write then about the work process in a New England farming family in the 1830s really is informed by that. I don't figure very prominently in this story, nor should I. But I think with most of these kinds of exercises in experiential research, we get new questions that we would never think to ask if we're not actually doing the thing. And by asking those kinds of questions, I was able then to go back to the paper archive and look for other kinds of evidence that would help me understand how, again, a New England teenager would have made choices about how to complete her work and what the implications of those choices might be for the enslaved seamstress who's sewing that cloth into jackets and pants several thousand miles away.
Well, that experience is the perfect segue because you organized your book, Plantation Goods, into 3 sections: production, distribution, and consumption. And as we were just talking about production, why don't we stay with that thread and explore early American manufacturing? So, Seth, would you tell us about factories and their development in the early United States? What did early American factories look like, and what kinds of goods were they producing?
The word factory is a very confusing word for early America. And one of the things that often misleads us is, of course, our minds immediately go to these large integrated spaces like the famed Lowell Mills, these places where the laborers are living on site and where production is integrated from the input of raw materials all the way to the packaged goods that go out into the world. This is, of course, what industrial technology comes to look like by the second half of the 19th century. But at the moment of the first American Industrial Revolution, running from, say, the late 1780s in a place like Pawtucket, Rhode Island, through the small mill villages that would spring up in the Blackstone Valley and throughout central Massachusetts and into Connecticut in the 18-teens, 1820s, and 1830s, factory is really a misleading term. A factory might be some kind of water-powered wheel that takes cloth that has been woven by people at home and finishes it by using teasels or to full it at a fulling mill. Or a factory might be a place that has the technology to spin yarn out of wool or cloth, but not yet to weave that yarn or to then teasel it or subject it to any of the other kinds of processes that are necessary before it becomes a saleable good. So many of the manufacturers who are sort of cutting their teeth in the 18-teens and 1820s at this moment of a first American Industrial Revolution are integrating some aspects of mechanization with many other traditional modes of household production. And so you may have, say, a particular batch of cloth and say, right, the wool is spun into yarn at a factory. It is sent out to dozens of farming families who warp it onto their own looms and weave it and then produce cloth that is brought back to the factory. At the factory, then it is teaseled and fulled and prepared for distribution, but then maybe it is cut into pieces, which are then redistributed to farming families to sew into garments. And so with a thing like a jacket that is made in Rhode Island for an enslaved man to wear in the 1830s, at a moment when the New England manufacturers move into ready-made clothing for plantation markets, all of a sudden you might see 2 elements of it done in a factory and 3 elements of it done at home. And it is really the ability of people who call themselves manufacturers to integrate these different kinds of productive systems. Some which rely upon family labor, some which rely upon wage labor, some of which rely upon orphan or indented labor, right? Without any kind of overall commitment to, we're moving to the wage economy in the mechanized factory. That will come later.
I'm struck by how much it seemed like early factory owners really worked like general contractors, the ones coordinating all the labor that goes into something. So these owners really had to coordinate every aspect of the manufacturing process before they could produce and ship these final goods. So Seth, what came first? The goods that plantation owners wanted for enslaved people so that factory owners could then work backwards from this is the good and these are the appropriate manufacturing systems I need to produce this good? Or did the factory and manufacturing systems come first, where they built these systems that were capable of producing different types of goods that people wanted? So how did factory owners know what goods plantation owners wanted, and how were they able to set up the right systems?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. So there are a couple ways to sort of get to the answer here. One is, of course, to recognize that Britain has a 50-year head start on industrial production, and they're pretty good at it. And indeed, when the 13 colonies that would become the United States are part of the British Empire, it is British manufacturers, Welsh weavers, Scottish weavers, English ironworkers who are, in fact, making the hoes and the shovels and the jackets and the pants and the cloth that will be distributed to slaveholders to distribute to slaves in places like South Carolina or places like Virginia. And what happens after American political independence is this desire for economic independence, which really takes off in the early 1800s around the period of the embargo and then the War of 1812. And it is the notion that the United States is still dependent upon its former colonizer for many of its goods that really spurs a kind of manufacturing energy that by the end of the 18-teens really hits its stride with the creation of a national protective tariff that then becomes even more robust in the 1820s into the 1830s. So it's a very specific moment in time where people are like, we should manufacture. Okay, great. What do you want to manufacture? And this is where sort of leading families in given communities who might have access to water power and have a wheel that maybe had been used in the 1780s or 1790s to grind corn Now we're thinking, oh, we can use that same wheel to run a trip hammer in order to make axe heads, or we can run spindles off this same wheel. Great. And so they begin to try to figure out how to do that. But then there is the question of markets. And this is really a case where, given sort of leading men, manufacturers in these communities, it is so tied to their own personal and economic networks. So in one town, someone says, hey, I have a cousin who's in New Bedford, and he says that if we could make whaleman shoes, we could make a killing. And so every family in that town is doing basically outwork shoemaking in order to make whaleman shoes. And the next town over, someone's like, hey, I know a dude in New Orleans, and he tells me that if we can make brogans for slaves, then we can make a killing. And so everyone in that town is doing that. So what I end up finding in the book is that there are a series of sort of scattered outposts throughout the New England landscape where virtually every family is making stuff for slaves. And yet the next town over, every family is doing something very different. They're also weaving at home, but the weaving that they're doing is intended for canalmen in upstate New York, or for markets in Latin America, or for basically being vended to working class people in Boston, whatever it might be. And yet the next town over, everyone is basically put to work making goods that will find a market in Alabama or a market in Mississippi. There's a process by which the company that I'm most interested in, the Roland Gibson Hazard and Company, or Peacedale Manufacturing Company in Southern Rhode Island, they're like, great, we know how to have some idea of how to make cloth. Let's figure out what cloth there is to make, and then let's ask those people how we should make it, and then we'll do that. And so it's not as though they develop a set of products directly for the plantation market. They hear from a merchant in Philadelphia that their goods seem to be finding a following among slaveholders who are purchasing in Philadelphia. And so they write to slaveholders and they say, well, what do you need this to be? And the slaveholders provide them with very precise information. Oh, it should be 32 inches wide, not 28 inches wide, and not 36 inches wide. It should be 14 ounces to the yard, not 16 ounces to the yard, not 10 ounces to the yard. It should have a cotton warp and a woolen weft. It should be striped or colored in this way, but not that way. It should be twill woven. No, it should be plain woven. And all this information they gather, and thus they do it, and then they send it back and say, aha, we made this specially for you, especially for slaves. And thus they develop sort of a market niche so that by the end of the 1820s, the goods that the Hazards are making in Southern Rhode Island can be marketed by name brand, in a place like Charleston as clothing especially designed for enslaved people to use.
The Hazards seem like real go-getters. Like, they were very interested in listening to their customers. And so Roland and his brother would just take these long Southern tours where they visited plantations, they visited mercantile stores, not only so that they could see the goods that people wanted, but so that they could listen about the improvements people wanted made to those goods that they were already purchasing and that the Hazards wanted to produce. Was this type of personal, hands-on market research where New England factory owners would venture into the South and tour around and listen to people, was this typical of New England factory owners or just typical of the Hazards?
It was. Many of these people would not have known anything about plantation labor from their lives in central Massachusetts or the middle of Connecticut by the early 19th century. So they did, in fact, travel to the South and gather ideas. And they spoke with merchants, and they spoke with slaveholders, and they spoke with enslaved people to try to figure out the design elements that would make the most marketable axe or the most marketable pair of shoes. The Hazards, though, are remarkable, if only because of the survival of their archive. This is a company that is run by two brothers, Isaac Peace Hazard, who's born in 1794, and Roland Gibson Hazard, who's born in 1801. And they really come of age at this entrepreneurial moment within American culture. And they are, as you say, go-getters. But their business practice involves one of the two brothers spending about 6 months of the year, either in Charleston in the 1820s or New Orleans in the 1830s and 1840s, developing markets, doing additional research, doing plantation to plantation sales, traveling to see their goods in use. And because the two brothers are running the firm, every day the brother who's on the road writes a letter back to the brother who's in Rhode Island. And so They save every letter. And of course, like good 19th century correspondents, they write many of the same things day after day with some expectation that the letters will be lost. But those letters then contain yet additional details. And so you can really see someone like Isaac Peace Hazard traveling in the Sea Islands in the late 1820s saying, I'm walking here to Riceboro and every third person is wearing our goods and they look great and they say they're holding up wonderfully. Or, I went to meet the leading planters of the Low Country and I brought my letter of introduction and they didn't need it because they knew who I was because my clothing is on every single one of their slaves' backs. But also, I went out to this plantation and asked Major Porcher to try out these 3 different axe models. And he gave them to his best man. And his best man said, this one was the better one because of the way in which the weight behind the handle was heftier and thus gave it a better swing, this kind of stuff. So yeah, they're doing sort of on the ground research and development. You could take another example, the Scoville Hoe Company in Haddam, Connecticut. One of the Scoville brothers goes down to Alabama as a mercantile apprentice in the early 1830s. And he's looking around and he really does say, like, if we could make a hoe that's indestructible, we would be millionaires. And so let's try to do that. And it turns out that his dad has an iron forge back in Connecticut and had been making rifle barrels and other things sort of in the orbit of Eli Whitney. And all of a sudden, the brother comes back and says, let's pivot everything to hoes. And so they start developing a prototype of what is sold as under the name of the planter's hoe in the early 1840s. They send out spec hoes to slaveholders saying, try these out, give us advice. Advice comes back, bevel the edge this way, add weight this way, put a second screw here. And then they roll out like hoe 2.0 and they get additional feedback. And then they send out sort of free samples and say, we're going to come visit your town somewhere in the next year and we'll do a demonstration. And literally, if this is not the best hoe you have ever used, your money back. These are very savvy marketers.
It also seemed like the New England manufacturer's goal of producing, in this case, the best, most indestructible hoe was at odds with enslaved people's desire to resist their enslavement. Because one of the ways that people resisted their enslavement, as you point out in your book, Plantation Goods, was by breaking their tools. Were you able to get a sense of how enslaved people felt when they received this new indestructible hoe?
Well, I don't think enslaved people believed anything was indestructible. And like working people everywhere contested the terms of their exploitation, oftentimes by putting the equipment out of order. And that is a classic strategy of resistance. And there's little evidence to suggest that this wasn't commonplace throughout the plantation South. What's interesting, of course, is that when slaveholders write about this, they never seem to see this as resistance. They seem to be like, oh, these people are too ignorant to use this tool right. How could this possibly be? This just proves that they should be slaves, as opposed to like, oh, how interesting. These people don't want to be enslaved, and maybe we should confront that fact. But the place that the book ultimately ends up is to talk about the ways in which enslaved people come to create a material culture around these provisioned goods, goods that they themselves did not choose, but goods that they're able to modify, that they're able to bend and make to do different kinds of things, goods that create the basis for internal economy and exchange among people on one plantation or across many plantations, and of course, goods that they do have a role in designing in a fairly indirect way when these northern salesmen come and they talk to people and say, what do you think? And they say, these blues are terrible, or this stuff shredded by Christmas, you should make it twill woven rather than plain woven. And there's a good deal of evidence of these manufacturers or their sales agents talking to plantation seamstresses, talking to enslaved axemen, and getting really important information that will come to design these goods. This does not mean that the following year, when slaveholder Jones hands out new axes and someone says, oh, thank goodness, it's a Collins axe. I don't think there is really much consolation in this fact. On the other hand, if people are being compelled to labor under the threat of explicit violence, and if meeting daily kinds of work quotas is crucial to avoiding that violence, then being equipped with a good axe is much better than being equipped with a bad axe. Or being equipped with shoes that protect your feet is better than being provisioned with no shoes at all, or clothing that wicks moisture off your body rather than clothing that sticks to your body and constrains your movement and your range of motion as you're moving up and down cotton rows, that actually has implications. Again, none of this is to say that slaveholders were trying to make the lives of the enslaved easier, nor is it to say that enslaved people were pleased with the goods that they were issued. It is simply to say that the kinds of design decisions that were taking place in New England around how to make a kind of cloth or how to design an axe had real implications for the work lives and the political lives of enslaved people and the kinds of strategies that enslaved people then had to undertake in order to avoid the most debasing violence or in order to carve out smaller spaces of personal autonomy or to create material culture that might allow someone to feel beautiful despite having been issued a dress that was not of their own choosing.
Something I found fascinating while reading Plantation Goods is that manufacturers experienced a lot of growing pains. Essentially, factory owners were really trying to transition away from working like general contractors who coordinated every piece of work to becoming people who oversaw mechanized production. And it seemed that one of the grievances enslaved people had with this transition from piecework to mechanized production was the fact that they might get cloth, but that cloth would be very inconsistent. Different bolts of cloth would have different widths or thicknesses or varying quality, and these inconsistencies would make the work of enslaved people much more difficult. Seth, let's take a moment to hear from our episode sponsors, and then let's discuss the evolution of factories into places that were capable of producing goods at scale. Ben Franklin's World exists because of listeners like you, people who believe that history matters and that good storytelling can bring it to life. As you know, this show is independently produced by Clio Digital Media, the nonprofit that Joe Edelman, Karen Wolf, and I founded to support this podcast and other history-focused work, like the History Behind the Headlines newsletter. Now, we don't have any institutional funding, so no university or other organizations support this podcast. But what we have is even better. A dedicated community of history lovers like you who make this show possible. Your support matters. Every gift, whether it's $5, $25, or $100, helps us bring you in-depth conversations with leading historians who help us uncover overlooked areas of history and spotlight new and exciting research. Your support keeps this podcast free and accessible to everyone. And because Clio Digital Media is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, your donation is fully tax deductible. If you've already given, thank you. Gwen B., Donald C., Denise C., Madeleine D., and Daniel H., your generosity makes all the difference. Thank you so much for your donations. Now, if you're ready to help keep Ben Franklin's World going strong, visit benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for helping us bring early American history to life. Seth, would you talk to us about the evolution of factories and how they came to be places where manufacturing happened at scale and how achieving that scale impacted enslaved workers' lives and work?
Yeah, you're exactly right that there's a whole bunch of working out the kinks, if you will, in the early decades of the 19th century. And in some cases, New England manufacturers have complete incentives to try to bring in new technologies that will take out some of the human element. Yet in other cases, there's really no incentive to do so if they can continue to produce goods using household labor more economically and cheaply. So, for example, in the tool making trade, the making of machetes, the making of axes, the making of shovels, manufacturers do engage with really cutting edge technologies by the 1830s, where workmen who are tinkerers and inventors get patents for a new kind of machinery that will allow for radically increased production and the standardization of goods that helps companies like the Collins Manufacturing Company become the industry standard for the axe or the industry standard for the cane machete. And yet in textile manufacturing for the hazards, there really isn't a lot of incentive to do such a thing because they have this rural workforce that is seemingly available to be mobilized in the production of goods through outwork or piecework conditions. So it's really all over the place. But I think for a lot of these manufacturers, one of the ideas is that to get good at manufacturing, you start with the crappiest stuff. And when you get better, you start making better stuff on the assumption that the better stuff is going to be a more lucrative market. So the hazards actually are quite explicit about this. We don't know anything about manufacturing. We have a minimum of technology, and we have a completely untrained rural workforce. We should probably start by making the worst stuff. The stuff that is not needing to be beautiful, stuff that is not needing to be made smooth or finished with much precision, stuff that is ultimately understood to be quite low end. And then when we figure that out, and as we get better at it, then we can move into other kinds of markets. So indeed, by the end of the 1840s and the 1850s, the hazards, who are still making goods for plantation markets, are also now making goods for middle-class women in Philadelphia. And they come to see this as a much better opportunity. And to the extent that they have new manufacturing technologies, they put that machinery towards making the better goods because that's a higher return on investment.
This still happens today. In the digital media and online business space, we call it minimum viable product. You create a product and then you put it out into the world with the idea that you're going to iterate and improve this product based on user feedback. And I actually did this with the new History Explorers Club I've been developing because it lets me focus on building what my members want rather than what I think they want. So in the end, it saves me a lot of time and money, and my customers, my members, get a product that they want.
Minimal viable product. I've not heard this before, but I like it a lot. And I think that this actually makes a lot of sense for what these companies are doing, producing textiles in particular for plantation markets. Absolutely. But as you also say, the fact that it's not very good is not an academic issue. It actually has real implications for a seamstress who is tasked on an Alabama plantation to make 50 pairs of pants by next Tuesday or be beaten. And if she knows how to cut patterns by memory and can envision looking at a 2-yard by 2-yard piece of cloth, how to cut the rectangles and triangles that are necessary to make a garment, if all of a sudden, because of the carelessness of a New England weaver, she's looking at a piece that's 28 inches wide before zooming back out to 32 inches wide, that's going to completely interfere with her work. That's going to make it much more difficult for her to meet the quotas that she's laboring under and subject her to violence because, again, of the carelessness of someone who will never see her 3,000 miles away.
I think a question on many of our minds is that New Englanders pride themselves, even in our own present day, we pride ourselves on being among the first Americans to abolish slavery. And yet, as we're discovering in our conversation with you, Seth, New England factories and labor were being used to undergird the system of slavery. Did New Englanders understand that their states may have abolished slavery, but that their factories and workforce were producing goods to support slavery's continuance in other states?
Yes and no, but certainly not to the extent that we might expect today. The obvious place to go is actually not to the company that is making machetes for Louisiana sugar fields, but actually to go to a place like Lowell and all the other parts of the New England cotton manufacturing complex, right? The heart of New England Industrial Revolution in the 19th century is cotton manufacturing, yet cotton does not grow in Massachusetts, nor in Vermont or New Hampshire. It grows and is only really available at this time at scale from the labor of enslaved men, women, and children in the plantation South. And so you can't have a Lowell without having a Mississippi. And that is not really part of a conversation in New England. Every once in a while, a Charles Sumner will call out the alliance of the lords of the loom and the lords of the lash, and people might begin to see. But for instance, for the organized abolitionists in Boston, you might think, you know what would be a really good strategy? Go chain yourselves to the gates of Lowell. They never choose to do that. In small communities like South Kingstown, Rhode Island, where the hazards are located, they're not really targeted by abolitionists. They're not called out. The Collins Manufacturing Company is not held up as a pariah firm by Connecticut abolitionists, even though those axes are clearing the creek lands of Alabama and Mississippi to turn them into cotton plantations. It just isn't part of their calculus. And this does seem very, very strange to us. But here's the piece that becomes more challenging for us to get our minds around, but which is really one of the great challenges of making sense of moral reasoning in the 19th century around issues like slavery. If we were to time travel back and interview Roland Gibson Hazard, the leading manufacturer of slave textiles in New England, and say, Mr. Hazard, is it true that you're skimming profit atop a system of human exploitation? He would say, what are you talking about? I was like, well, what are you doing? And he would say, and this is the piece that sort of, again, makes us pause. He'd say, I'm a philanthropist. A what? A philanthropist. Well, how exactly would you say that? Well, first of all, by virtue of the labor that I'm creating here in New England, I'm allowing all of these incredibly impoverished subsistence farming families in the countryside achieve a higher standard of living because I'm providing them work that is allowing them to have a second dress and to have more coffee and tea and to have the ability to educate their children. And if you look around, our communities that were decrepit in 1800 are now by 1840 and 1850 flourishing with schools and lyceums and temperance societies. And this is all because I have created this work. And at the same time, by making warm and lasting clothing for slaves, I have eased their suffering. Would you rather the slaves be cold? Would you rather the slaves be barefoot? No, of course not. And so by providing these goods, I'm actually part of an amelioration project in order to ease the suffering of the slaves. And again, this would be very, very hard for us to get our minds around. We would say, well, this is really, truly self-delusion. You are providing the material infrastructure to allow for the perpetuation of slavery. You're not making anything better. And he'd say, well, of course I am. I'm interested in slavery ending. I don't think that slavery should be everywhere. I don't think that slavery is the future of the United States. I'm a member of the American Colonization Society. And indeed, in 1855, I will attend the first meeting of the Republican Party. And in 1860, I will go to the National Convention and support Abraham Lincoln's candidacy for president. And yet at the same time, while slavery continues to exist in the places where it does exist, shouldn't it be a good thing to make the lives of slaves better rather than worse? And so it's really hard to figure out what to do with some guy who's like, I'm against slavery, but I'm providing the material basis for enslaved plantation labor. And this kind of logic is all over the place.
Sometimes, even in our own time, when we benefit from something, we form a blind spot as to how that something we benefit from might have negative impacts on the environment or on someone else. So do you think New Englanders developed a blind spot when it came to the connections between the goods that they were producing in their factories and the slave system that their goods supported?
Well, I think your point is a really good one about how our own contemporary experience might, in fact, give us some insight into the kinds of moral blind spots that existed 2 centuries ago. And I suppose, Liz, we can say, gosh, when historians judge us 200 years from now, they're going to say all sorts of stuff. Well, how is it that this person sent money for some kind of charity program to feed starving people in Africa, but stepped over homeless people in San Francisco every single day that they went to work? How is it that these people talked about how committed they were to the environment, but they continued to have a hamburger once in a while? Or how great that this person committed themselves to paper straws, but they took 4 trips to Europe each year on an airplane. Does that make a person a hypocrite? I don't think we would want to be called hypocrites, right, for those kinds of things. But I would say that we make choices and we are confronted with all sorts of implications for our actions. And I would say that this is sort of the condition of Western modernity, or of the affluent global North vis-a-vis the global South today. So whether we're thinking about our carbon footprints, or whether we're thinking about our fair trade coffee, or the sweatshop-free sweatshirts that we buy in a college bookstore, or whether we're thinking about our college endowments and whether they are cleanly invested, or whether we're thinking about the rare earth minerals that are supposedly helping the world because of our electric car batteries, and yet are tied to horrific terms of labor exploitation in other parts of the globe, right? We're constantly confronted with this, and yet there's no way out in a way. So we make choices. So the issues that you're worked up about are going to be different from the issues that I'm worked up about. The things that I say I can live without participating in ordering from Amazon because I don't want to be tied to that corruption. But gosh, I love hamburgers, and I gotta eat meat. I don't really want someone 200 years from now to be like, this person is morally above this person. And this is ultimately, I think, a point that I try to drive home in this book, which, as your question has brought forth, this is a book that is not just about the past, but it is very much about our present and our future. And the idea that I want to run with in this book is that the concept of complicity with a form of injustice, whether it's climate degradation, whether it's the exploitation of human labor, whether it's violence against animals because we eat them, whatever it is, that the category of complicity that is so often used to describe how people are or aren't, I don't think is a very good one. And in fact, I don't think it is possible to say you are complicit and you are not complicit. I think it's more possible and more probable, particularly in an integrated global economy of huge numbers of entanglements, to say complicity is the baseline condition of the human experience. And thus the question begins and becomes, what do we do about it? How do we live within it? How do we make our choices within it? And that becomes a more interesting kind of historical question. So when I'm writing about these people in the 19th century, I don't, in fact, say, here's my list of people who are complicit. Here's my list of people who are not complicit. Rather, I say every one of these people is complicit in some ways, and the choices that they're making about how to square these circles actually become the interesting questions for us to study historically.
This is another good segue because one of the modern day issues that we face today is race. And it's an issue with a very long history in the United States. And in Plantation Goods, Seth goes into details about how plantation goods contributed to the materiality of race and race making in the early United States. So those ideas that early Americans created about race and the goods that people of a race would use. So Seth, how did plantation goods specifically help early Americans develop ideas about race and racial identity?
One of the ways that scholars talk about race as something that isn't a biological reality so much as a social convention is that various kinds of claims are made about difference, whether connecting ancestry to biology in various kinds of ways, but that these ideas have to be promulgated, they have to be reiterated, they have to be rehearsed in lots of spaces to gain a kind of social currency to make them real. So for scholars studying the early 19th century who are interested in how white Americans in particular came to think about Black Americans as different, they say, well, a lot of this is happening in the realm of science and in medicine. And if we read the journals that are being published by doctors, they're increasingly categorizing people by ancestry. And those notions of ancestry are increasingly rigid. And thus we have sort of a biomedical production of race. And then we might look at other people who are like, what's really interesting is the minstrel stage. How amazing that American popular culture consumed by white people in the 1820s and 1830s in the heart of American culture like New York City is all about mocking Black people and creating the category of whiteness vis-a-vis the foibles and silliness that we can cast on Black actors who are talking funny and dancing funny, or white actors in blackface talking funny, dancing funny, things like this. And other people are like, actually, it's in the law that race is made real because lawyers and legislators are basically creating different criminal codes that attend to people who can be categorized as Black or categorized as white in different kinds of ways. And I was interested in thinking about another venue in which white people are talking a lot about Black people and creating ideas about Black difference, despite not knowing any Black people and not actually being interested in knowing any Black people. And that has to do with then plantation goods. Plantation goods provide an amazing vehicle for white people in the North and in the South to talk about Black people, to talk about how Black people's bodies are different and therefore they need a different kind of cloth in their clothing, or how Black laborers are not smart enough to know how to operate a hoe without breaking it, and therefore they need this kind of tool that might be different from the kind of tool that you would sell to an upstate New York white farming family. And in countless conversations in New England factories or across the counter of a Charleston shop, you will have white people going back and forth, negotiating, haggling, talking about Black people. And these goods in their mundane, everyday nature, I think, create this venue for new kinds of what I would call, in scare quotes, racial knowledge to emerge. New ideas that allow white people to think of themselves as different from Black people, vis-a-vis something as ordinary as a pair of shoes or a shovel. And so I try in the book to talk about all the different kinds of conversations that emerge in northern spaces and southern spaces around racial knowledge. And one of the most disturbing artifacts that I turned up in the book and that gets a good deal of attention is this agricultural implement catalog that is published by a New York City firm in the early 1850s called the Planter's Agricultural Almanac. It's really a sales catalog for a company that is selling all sorts of farm tools, but it's an illustrated catalog in which the narrators are basically several enslaved men who are speaking in dialect, and it's like a minstrel show on the page. And I was very interested in sort of what kind of circulation this document may have gotten or who would have been reading it. And it turns out it's not really an almanac for Southern users. White Southerners don't need Black people caricatured in this kind of way. Living in societies that in many counties have Black majorities, this wouldn't really have the same kind of resonance. That this was a product really for white people in New England and in New York and in Pennsylvania who didn't know any Black people, who were unlikely to have any firsthand experience with Black people, but who could participate in sort of the culture of debasement and minstrelsy through this kind of catalog and have a good laugh at it, and in the process come to think of themselves as different, to come to think of themselves as white vis-a-vis these other people who they would come to think about as Black. And in that sense, these tools and this clothing comes to have a role that I would place alongside the sort of biomedical discourse or the theater or other kinds of popular culture that are consistently producing race in this period.
Kyle is curious to know how far this discourse spread. He'd like to know how far New England-made plantation goods traveled across slavery's hemisphere, and whether these early American ideas about race traveled with these goods to places like Cuba and South America.
This is a really good question, and I can tell you much more about the movement of the goods themselves than I can tell you about the cultural ideas that surround the goods. And that's, of course, because when we think about race as a way of organizing power in a society, the needs that race has to fulfill are going to be different in a slave society than in a society that is predominantly free or predominantly white. And so what race does in order to keep some people powerful and other people out of power in Cuba is going to look different than it is in New York, is going to look different than it is in Brazil, and so on and so forth. So it's not simply one story. But one example of a New England-made product that will come to have huge hemispheric consequences is the sugarcane machete that the Collins Company begins to manufacture in central Connecticut in the 1850s. They actually receive an order from a Cuban sugar planter saying, we would like you to fabricate this kind of machete. Can you make the handle this long? Can you make the blade this size? Can you angle it this way? And they produce one that soon becomes the industry standard of sugarcane machetes. And after the American Civil War, the Collins come to even have a much bigger share of the sugarcane machete market throughout the Americas and all the places that sugar is being produced. And even into the 20th century, the Collins machete is so ubiquitous in much of Latin America that I'm told that if you were to walk into a hardware store in many places and ask for El Collins, someone just hand you a machete. That, like Kleenex of facial tissue or Xerox of photocopiers, Collins becomes synonymous with the machete itself. And that gives you a sense of how these American firms come to have this footprint. It's also one of the things to mention that after slavery ends in the United States, many of these New England manufacturers simply pivot to other kinds of plantation markets and continue to develop goods that are primarily intended for enslaved people to use. And the Collins machete in places like Cuba and Brazil in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, even into the 1880s, is quite an important story.
Seth, how do you hope your book, Plantation Goods, and its study of the material objects of slavery will help us better understand early United States history and the practice of slavery in the early United States?
My main goal here is to have readers understand slavery as a national institution, not as simply something that happens in one part of the United States as another part of the United States is marching towards the progress and the future and the freedom that we tend to celebrate. I want slavery to be understood as a national institution, even as it may simply be regionally located. But I think its economic implications are truly national in scope, and I want people to be attentive to that. I would like there to be more books that narrate the experience of mill hands and field hands between the same covers. I would like more scholarship that recognizes a common system rather than two divergent systems. I would rather have fewer books, one on the North and one on the South, and more books that are about the ways in which interregional commerce or the movement of ideas or legal culture creates one national way of thinking about slavery and thinking about race. And I think this will help us create a better understanding of the complexities of the early 19th century and rely less on the Civil War as the thing that in some ways predetermines that there's one path going to the future and one path that is going to be left behind. And I think it's simply much more complicated than that.
Well, we should move into our next segment, 1776 in context. Now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, in your opinion, Seth, what role did the American Revolution play in the development of slavery in the early United States and the economic infrastructure early Americans built to support slavery?
Oh, this is such a good question. And I suppose it's a difficult question because it depends on how do you define the American Revolution. If you define the American Revolution as the mobilization of 13 colonies to contest their position within the British Empire that culminates in July 4th, 1776, and then leads to another 5 or 6 years of war, we would have one story. And if we thought about the American Revolution as something that ultimately stretches to the Constitution, we might have a different story. But if we take the more narrow story, that one that would draw our attention to the semi-quincentennial and draw our attention to things like the mobilization of the colonies to resist their position within the British Empire, I think slavery is doing lots of different kind of work. It's doing, of course, rhetorical work. When taxation can be made equivalent with enslavement, that rhetoric only works because people have some sense of what slavery actually means. And we might think that that would make the comparison seem more absurd. But instead, it seems within the political processes of the 1760s and 1770s to actually make it more resonant and to alert more American colonists to the idea that their position in the empire has left them in that same kind of vulnerable position. I think slavery also matters a great deal to the revolution itself in light of the fact that the 13 North American colonies are a small part of a British Empire that in the Americas is overwhelmingly oriented towards the production of sugar using enslaved labor in the Caribbean. And in some ways, the 13 North American colonies have a role to play as sort of the provisioning colonies for Barbados, for Jamaica in this period. And it's not surprising then that during the war itself, the British Navy alongside the French Navy, the real action may be in the Caribbean and about who's going to control those very, very, very valuable plantation islands, and efforts to sort of protect those spaces has implications for how the fighting unfolds, where the French fleet is, where the British fleet is. And I think we should recognize this as part of it. I mean, we see this earlier, like in the Articles of Association, right? When what's going to be embargoed? Well, lots of things with the implication that the North American colonies are going to starve the plantation colonies by no longer sending them the foodstuff that enslaved people are dependent upon in places like Jamaica and places like Barbados in the middle of the 1770s, or the exemption for South Carolina rice in the Articles of Association. What's that about? Who's growing that South Carolina rice? That matters a great deal here, too. So I think there are lots of ways to sort of write slavery into the American Revolution. I don't know that we have to say or would want to say that the kind of independence that most colonists wanted included the independence and the opportunity to own other human beings. But that was not absent. And certainly the aftermath of the American Revolution brings us a kind of freedom and a notion of liberty that for a significant portion of the population includes the liberty to hold other people in bondage. And again, I don't think we can write that out of the history of the American Revolution that we tell.
I know you've been working on this project for years, Seth, so perhaps you're just basking in its completion. But I always like to ask, do you have another research project that you've started?
Oh, I wish it were the latter, but it is indeed the former. So I'll see you here in 2037, and that'll be great. I've embarked on a project that seems quite daunting, but actually I'm very excited about it. And I hope that, in fact, I can bring this to conclusion with a little bit more haste. But I'm writing a volume that will focus on the United States from the 1760s all the way into the 1840s. And it will sit in the penguin history of the United States, coming between Alan Taylor's book, American Colonies, and Stephen Hahn's book, A Nation Without Borders. And this is a daunting assignment, how to write a synthetic account of the birth of the United States and the early Republic period, sitting between these two giants within the historiography. But I think there's a real opportunity, and particularly to think about this history from the perspective of a field that I've found myself immersed in over the last couple of decades, this history of capitalism, and to think about how we might narrate the relationship between the political sovereignty that the United States has achieved through its independence vis-a-vis an economic sovereignty that is much less present and that indeed will be a laggard. And so to think about what national independence means in a global system in which foreign capital and foreign investment is crucial to the developmental opportunities in the United States, or where British demand for slave-grown cotton is really the engine of the American export economy for decades into the 19th century, or where the United States doesn't have its own specie until much later and thus is dependent upon global flows of hard currency that it does not control. All of these issues, I think, change the way we might narrate everyday life in the United States. And that's what I'm interested in exploring in this volume, thinking as I've done in Plantation Goods and as I've done in Scraping By about the sort of social history of common people, but recognizing that their opportunities and their vulnerabilities are not necessarily determined exclusively by the state or by wealthy people within their own societies, but by some mysterious force that we might call global capital.
Well, 2037 is a really apt year because that'll be the 250th anniversary of the Constitution. So we'll be ready for you, Seth.
I'll be ready. I'll be there.
We may have just spent the last hour talking, but we've only just scratched the surface of your book, Plantation Goods. So if we read your book in all its rich detail and still have questions, where can we reach you?
I am easily discoverable in the Brown University Department of History, and you'll find at the Brown University Department of History website my email address, and I'm very happy to answer questions for anyone who would like to know more about this project.
Seth Rockman, thank you for joining us and for taking us through the everyday items of enslavement and how the manufacturing economy of New England was entwined with the slave economy of the South.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for a great conversation, Liz.
Seth Rockman just showed us how even the most mundane items, shoes, jackets, hose, and cloth, are rich with historical meaning. These plantation goods were not just tools and textiles. These were the material infrastructure of American slavery. These goods reveal how deeply interconnected the United States was, with New England factories and families producing the very items that sustained plantation labor in the South. Now, by tracing the life of a single pair of shoes from Massachusetts to Mississippi, Seth opens our eyes to the surprising ways that everyday goods can link distant peoples, places, and power structures. His work challenges us to reconsider traditional North-South narratives and asks us to confront the uncomfortable reality that slavery was not just a Southern institution, it was a national institution. And perhaps most importantly, this conversation asks us to reflect on how we think about complicity and responsibility in our own time. In a world where our clothing, technology, and food are often the result of hidden labor in global systems, what do our everyday items and choices say about us? What stories might future historians tell from the artifacts that we leave behind? Look for more information about Seth, his book, Plantation Goods, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/422. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. After all, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what everyday objects in your life might reveal a hidden history about your labor and your connections to the global world? I'd love to know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.